Wonderful. Thank you so much, Hannah. So today I am thrilled to have Jakana Thomas with us today, who will be presenting on rebel women in the Civil War peace process. So Jakana Thomas is an associate professor in the School of Global Policy and Strategy and Department of Political Science at the University of California, San Diego. Her research examines how rebel women shape the path to peace during civil wars and the relationship between women's participation in rebellion and incidents of negotiation. Her research also investigates rebel women's roles in encouraging gender-inclusive peace terms. So if you were with us last week or 2 weeks ago, it's a perfect follow-on to our speaker. She's a faculty affiliate at UC San Diego's Center on Gender and Health and an advisory board member for several organizations, including the Resolve Network, housed at the United States Institute of Peace, the American Bar Association's Women and Girls Empowered Network, and the Empirical Study of Gender Network. She's an associate editor at the H. Diplo International Security Studies Forum, where her research focuses on the gender dimensions of political violence with an emphasis on women's participation in violent political organizations. Her work has appeared in the American Political Science Review, American Journal of Political Science, Journal of Politics, International Organization, and the Journal of Peace Research. So, as per usual, Jakana will speak for 50 minutes like our other speakers, and then we'll have about 25 minutes for Q&A. As always, we ask your questions are relevant to the topic at hand presented and brief and posed in the form of a question. So Elizabeth, for those of you online, will be handling the Q&A and reading your questions aloud. So if you're online, please just pop your questions in the online Q&A function, and then in the room, we'll have the roaming mic as usual. So with that, I will hand it over to Jakana.
Thank you all for having me today. I'm very excited to present this work to you today, which is actually conveniently co-authored with the speaker from last week, Elizabeth Brennan, and another scholar, Laura de Blasi. So this project is forthcoming in the Journal of Politics. And in this paper, we're asking, how does women's participation in rebellion influence the peace process? And specifically, what I'm going to be talking about today is, do women influence rebels' participation in negotiations? So before I say all this, I'm going to do two things. The first, I'm going to try to speak about this paper, and then I'm going to try to wrap it up with some of the other work that I do, which is part of this broader research agenda. And this is the first time I'm really presenting this paper, so I'm looking forward to your feedback here. So this seems like the wrong place to start, because everyone in this room knows what the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda is and what UN's Security Council Resolution 1325 is. But I'll just give a brief overview and explain how it's related to the specific question that I'm asking today. So the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 it basically calls for the integration of women and gender perspectives into the peace process. And this call was spurred and motivated by the disproportionate effect that conflict has on women and girls. And it also seeks to add women into peace processes to bolster these peace efforts. And this general idea that including women in peace processes or including women is beneficial to peace processes has been supported by a lot of empirical evidence. So there's a lot of empirical support for this Women, Peace, and Security agenda very broadly. Scholars have found, including I think Maria O'Reilly, who will be another speaker in the series, has found that women's participation in the peace process increases the probability that settlements will be reached in civil conflicts. Other scholars have found that having women at the table and integrated into formal peace processes will increase the probability that peace terms that are in peace agreements will actually be implemented. And then there's other literature that suggests that having women at the peace table will ensure the durability of that peace. So after we've signed peace agreements, conflicts are less likely to recur when women are at the table. And there's been other evidence in other literature that suggests that when women are at the peace table, they ensure that peace agreements are going to be more equitable and fair, which also has these trickle-down effects on the durability of peace. Other scholars have found that when women are participating in politics more generally, and so today I'm going to think about this as traditional politics, peace is going to be more durable. So conflicts are going to be less likely to start, both intrastate and interstate conflicts are going to be less likely to start. And if they start and they're resolved, they're going to be less likely to recur when women have an important role in traditional politics. So in most of these studies, they're thinking about women's participation in the government in the form of legislature, or when they're represented in the government in official roles. Okay. However, so this research is, again, very supportive of the general notion that women bolster peace and security. And it suggests that integrating women in gender perspectives are really going to be consequential. But where this research, I think, falls short is, and this is very similar to, I'm sure, any other critique that you've heard of the women, peace, and security agenda, is it's not exactly clear which women should be integrated into these processes. And it's not exactly clear whether all gender perspectives should be represented. Do all women lead to peace? And do all gender perspectives lead to the same kind of peace effect that these studies have found? And specifically, what I'm going to focus on today in this talk is this literature and practice has largely overlooked the role that women, militant women, might play in fostering or bolstering peace, right? A lot of the work has focused on women in civil society, and specifically women in civil society's formal roles in peace processes, but they don't think about, if the general idea is that women bolster peace efforts, what happens when we look at women who have participated in violence? Do they also lead to the same kind of effect of bolstering peace? And so the specific question we tackle in this paper is, do rebel women have a pacifying effect that we assume other women have? And the reason this is actually kind of important and consequential is, as my other work shows, there's a lot of variation in where women participate in conflicts, and women participate in conflicts in all regions of the world. And this specific figure comes from the Women in Armed Rebellion dataset, a dataset I put together with Reed Wood at the University of Essex. And we're specifically looking at where women participate in combat forces. So if we broaden out this idea and this definition of women rebels, which we'll do just a minute, we see that there's quite a bit of women's participation across all regions of the world. Right? All regions of the world, there is some women who have participated in rebellion, and in some regions, we get extremely high amounts of women's participation in rebellion. Up to 40% of fighting force is made up of women. So like in the FARC and in the PKK, we see large amounts of women's participation. In newer data, Meredith Logan and Hilary Matfis just released a new data set looking at women's activities in armed rebellion, looking beyond just when they participate in combat forces. And what they find is, in contemporary conflicts, 63%, so almost 2/3 of rebel organizations fighting during that time period include women in some role. More than half of them include women in the fighting forces, and 45% of rebel organizations have women within the leadership, right? And so what that suggests is that women are not just in conflicts, they're participating in the political and military decision-making of these conflicts, which leads us to wonder, what difference does that make? Does it make a difference for those groups' behavior, right? And so we might want to assume that, militant women are the same as men, or maybe they don't have any impact at all. But studies already have shown that the diversity of military organizations has a tangible effect on those groups' behavior. So Jason Lyle's work looking at state military shows that racial diversity has an important impact on cohesion and military effectiveness. Humphreys and Weinstein show that the backgrounds of combatants matter for how they behave towards civilians. And then Hare and Bowe-Melt show that the age, so looking at child soldiers, affects groups' behavior towards civilians. And so if we were to take this literature, we might assume that gender diversity should have some impact on these organizations, though thus far we don't really know exactly what that impact should be. And so again, what we're going to focus on in this paper is, are militant women also, can militant women also be thought of as a force for peace? And so this is a long talk. I've been given license to talk for 50 minutes, so I'm just going to give you the bottom line up front and tell you what I find, and then I'll tell you how I get there. So in this study, we find that women members, so when groups are gender diverse, so when they have women within these organizations, these groups are more likely to participate in negotiations with the state. So we're specifically looking at intrastate conflicts, so civil wars and civil conflicts. And then secondly, we find that when women are represented within these rebel organizations, they are more likely to also appeal for talks. And so we're thinking about these as two different mechanisms. So on the one hand, and I'll get into this in detail a little bit, on the one hand, these organizations are more likely to be seated at negotiation tables, and there's lots of ways that they might get to the negotiating table. It could be because they're looked at as more legitimate or more forceful. But the second mechanism says that it's not just that they're invited to the table more, it's that those organizations take initiative to institute these peace talks more frequently. And so we show evidence of this in this paper. And so this paper, we believe, makes several contributions to the literature, and we hope it also kind of pushes policy forward in a couple of important ways. So the first thing that we think this paper does is we think it adds to this rich body of work on women, peace, and security. And it does so by shifting focus away from just thinking about peaceful women, peace women, which has been the primary focus of practice, to really think about whether militant women also play a role and can play a role in women peace, in propping up women, peace, and security. And we specifically think that this is a hard test for what we're going to call this woman peace hypothesis, right? This is this idea that women are positive forces for peace, because we show by looking at militant women, it's not just that women have a natural proclivity toward peace, right? These are clearly women who don't have a natural proclivity toward peace because they've engaged in militancy. So it's not just that, but there is something that we'll say predisposes women toward compromise and peace. We think this paper is also important because it shifts focus away from just thinking about when women have a seat at the table and thinking about what women might be doing behind the scenes to encourage whether those groups get to the table, and then what they do when they get there, right? And so this is kind of important because you all know in this room, when we think about international negotiations, women are not represented in large numbers the way that they're represented as combatants, right? We rarely get more than 10% of women negotiators. We rarely get more than 2% of signatories. So this is not common to see women take on these formal roles in peace processes. And that would lead us to believe that women don't do anything for peace, right? They don't have the opportunity to affect peace processes. However, if we think beyond just these formal roles, we might be able to see that there's more that women are doing for these processes. And then lastly, we believe that this project adds to this burgeoning research that examines the effect of women on rebellions and conflict processes. And we think that this is important because a lot of research, including my own, has focused on cataloging women's participation and showing us that they exist, right? That women rebels are there and that they're doing all of these really important things. But the question that we inevitably get, or I should say, I inevitably get every time I present my work on this is, so what? Does it make a difference that there are women in these groups? Does it change what these groups do? Do women have any power and agency in these organizations? And most of the time we assume no, but what I'm interested in looking at is evidence for where they do, right? That in some cases, even when they might be constrained, they do have the opportunity to have an impact on what these groups do. Okay, so I'm gonna start the paper with an anecdote from Sudan. So in 2005, the chief mediator and the African Union Special Envoy Salim Ahmed Salim argued that it was time to start incorporating women into the peace process. It had been faltering up until this point. The combatants and the belligerents weren't really taking it seriously. They said, you know what we need to do? We need to kickstart this process by adding some women into the negotiations. And he argued that having women there would change the course of the peace process for three main reasons. The first is because women have unique interests that men don't have, and that by having women, they might have a different set of interests that they represent at the table, and this is a good thing. But importantly, he argued that they have a different approach toward compromise than men. They're more willing to compromise. And third, that even beyond just their own inclination to compromise, they have an ability to affect what men do, right? They can encourage men to pursue peace. And so if we start to incorporate women into these peace processes, we might be able to change what men are doing at the table. And so as a result of his advocacy, they added 3 female commanders from the Sudan Liberation Army to the negotiations. And this is the precursor to the Darfur peace process. That was a peace agreement that was signed in 2006. One of these women that was added was Miriam Abdallah Omar, which was an SLA commander. She was known as the mother of the army. And what's important about her is she wasn't just a woman that was added at the last minute she was one of the early adopters of the SLA, right? She joined the organization in 1999, was one of the very first combatants trained that received military training. And I'm not saying female combatant. She was one of the first combatants that were trained in this organization. So we could say she was a real militant, right? She really bought it. And when we think about, but as I mentioned, she was one of the people that were put forward as a negotiator, and Ahmed Salim believed that adding her to the negotiations somehow would change the course of the negotiations. One might ask, well, if she's a SLA combatant and she's really firmly rooted in this organization, why might we expect her to change the course of the negotiations? And there's some evidence here that comes from why she joined the conflict in the first place, and then what she says after. So Miriam Abdallah Omar joined the organization early on because she was angry at the government, who had killed her husband and a bunch of other family members, leaving her a widow to care for 13 children. And she was really just mad, and so she joined for retributive justice. There's also some evidence in some of the statements that she's made that she joined from material inducement. She had 13 kids and needed to find a way to support them, so she started selling weapons, and then she joined the organization, which provided her with some support. But although she was this ardent supporter of the SLA, when she was appointed to the negotiating team in 2005, she instantly changed her tack, right? She abandoned war and took up peace. She says, you know, we're here for peace, and we want real peace, and we have come all the way to look for peace, because she acknowledged that peace is better than war. So even this woman that fought could recognize that there is value in pursuing peace at the same time. And part of what explains how she could hold these dual perspectives in her head at the same time, that war is useful, but peace is better, is that women tend to be or express some sensitivity to war costs. And so Abdallah Omar argued that part of the reason why peace was so valuable to her is that women, like herself, had suffered so much in this war. And so she wanted peace so that she could go back to her everyday life of being a mother and a wife, rather than being forced into fighting, right? And she's not the only female combatant or female commander who's made this statement. Another woman who was part of the Darfur process, yet we're not exactly sure which Darfurian rebel group, because she said she's part of a Darfur rebel group. She argues that achieving lasting peace in Darfur is only really possible if you integrate women or include women in the conflict resolution and decision-making process. And this is partially because women play a vital role in this peace process, and she recognizes that it's women's objective. So they believe it's their role to advocate for peaceful resolution. So she talks about these roles that she believes that women should play. And so again, we ask this question, so why would a rebel woman who clearly embraced militancy have this effect, a different effect on peace than men? And so as I mentioned, some of this has something to do with the way that women are socialized, the types of values that women hold. And there is quite a bit of research that makes this connection, which we're going to call today the women in peace hypothesis, that women prefer peace, or women are or have a positive impact on peace. And some of the earliest studies suggested that it was women had a biological inclination toward peace. They're just born pacific or pacifist. There's been, as far as I know, very little empirical evidence to support this contention that women are pacifist and that they're born for peace. But there's been quite a bit of research that suggests that there's some socialization aspect, that women are not born for peace, but they're socialized for peace, right? And so in this paper, we kind of look at two different kind of mechanisms that explain how women might be socialized to favor peace. The first one is that they are socialized to have these roles. And specifically, scholars have argued that they're maternal roles that help them engender sympathy and feel sympathy for the disadvantaged, which is often in these contexts civilians. And then there's the second set of explanations that focus on women's social power, right? It's not that women necessarily have strong inclinations toward peace because they're socialized that way. It's that because they lack coercive power, and they've typically lacked coercive power, they have to find other ways to communicate and get their interests met. And this is in cooperating and collaborating, because they can't compel people to do what they want to do. They find other ways to kind of get what they want. And so we're going to talk about each of these in turn, but I'll start with the first one. So the first argument is that women's social roles predispose them, or at least encourage them, to pursue peace. And as I mentioned, it's that in most societies, women are expected to act as mothers or caregivers or nurturers. And even when they don't have children, from an early age, to socialize for this role, that they will grow up to have kids and they will grow up to nurture their children and nurture the elderly, nurture their parents. And this is supposed to encourage them to prioritize empathy and sympathy, especially with the people that they view as disadvantaged, right? So Rudick early in the 1980s argued that it's something about maternal practices that push women toward peace. And she says it's something about being a mother that emphasizes both the key ingredients to peace and reconciliation. And that's one, reconciliation and peace building. And this is because, she argues, mothers and pacifists both are more inclined to risk trust rather than trusting suspicion, and they seek reconciliation rather than victory, right? So women, because of these roles as mothers, are inherently, or I should not say inherently, they're socialized to, value caring for others and being trusting, and instead of thinking about things as a zero-sum game, which we'll come back to that, they think more about ways that they can be cooperative. And so this is something about motherhood. I'll go back just one second. Again, there's been some attempts to study this, including by Conover and Shapiro, and there's been very little evidence to show that being a mother directly correlates with one's attitudes toward peace. But generally, the idea is that even when you're not a mother, even if you don't have a child on your own, if you're a woman, you've been socialized to have to hold these traits. And so there, it's not just mothers and motherhood, it's just the socialization around this maternal role that pushes women this way. And so there have been numerous studies, especially that has used public opinion polling, that have found that there is this sex and gender gap with respect to approval for war, right? Women, scholars found that women tend to be averse to war because they think about the potential cost of war. And what scholars are suggesting is that this is really being driven by concern for civilians and concern for civilian life. So studies like Eichenberg suggest that women are not wholesalely averse to violence. So it's not that they don't use violence or they don't value violence. It's that they consider the cost of war when they're thinking about whether they should support violence or not. Other scholars have argued that women are sensitive to casualties or other kinds of suffering like starvation. And others found that it's not that, again, women are reluctant to engage in war. And in fact, when wars have humanitarian aims, such as, like, for example, their humanitarian interventions, women are more supportive of war than men are, right? And so when those wars are allegedly helping civilians out, women are more supportive of war than even men would be. And so again, there's some evidence that men and women have different attitudes toward war, and it's largely undergirded by this idea that they care about war costs. And so one question might be, do we actually observe this in militants, right? This is in American public opinion. This is around the Gulf War. Does this really translate to conflict settings? And there's, to date, very few studies that examine this, but there is a lot of anecdotal evidence that suggests that the same type of mechanism exists even among combatants, and specifically female combatants. So one case from the MPLF, FL in Liberia, Evelyn, the commando lady, says that when commandos were doing bad in town, so when the people she was commanding were doing bad, mainly men, she thought it was her role to try to assist in the problem. So for example, when they were trying to kill people, she would go behind them and convince them to stop. And so she said this is what she was doing. She was taking responsibility behind the fighters. And so when these men commanders or combatants would come into town ready to loot and rape and pillage, she thought it was her role to kind of get them to stop doing that, right? Another example, which there's been lots written about in both academic work and in popular accounts, Black Diamond in Lurd, who was a woman, she was a commander of the Women Auxiliary Forces in Lurd, argued that her role, again, was to stand up for civilians. She believed that it was her role to stand up for women that were the victims of war. And there are so many different accounts of people who were victimized by rebels, specifically Lurd, that would say they were almost dead. Someone was cutting them and she would step in and make them stop. And she and the other women in the walk had a saying that something like let no monkey try it or something like that. So basically the idea is that they didn't let anybody mess with people when they, or civilians when they were around. And specifically, even her male commanders argued that she was very serious on the battlefield. She had no qualms with harming people she viewed as belligerents or combatants, but when it came to civilians, that was her red line. She wouldn't cross. And one of the generals, Dragon Master, he's a battlefield commander in Lurd, said that although he had a lot of respect for these women, and again, they were fierce, they didn't sleep, they didn't bathe, they didn't have sex, when it came to caring for civilians, he noticed that they were different because they had less inclination to loot and to harm civilians compared to the male fighters. And so clearly, they don't have they don't reject violence, but there are limits to the violence that they're willing to sanction and accept. And other studies found that in after conflicts, female combatants in the Lord's Resistance Army were more likely to have post-traumatic stress or to feel haunted by war victims, the people they harmed in conflicts, than their male combatants, which again suggests that there is a red line that female combatants are even willing to cross, right? They don't mind killing people, they don't mind harming people, but they do have a problem with it being innocence. And this aligns very well with this other public opinion research that, again, women are not wholesale opposed to war, but they do have limits when it comes to the humanitarian cost of those wars. The one question that you might ask is, well, if they cared that much about civilians, why would they engage in war in the first place, right? These two things are antithetical. You can't care about civilians and then also simultaneously support war. And I would argue, and even women who have participated in these conflicts might argue that violence to them is instrumental, right? That there's a lot of supply side research that looks at the reasons women might join a rebellion, and those are sometimes for protection. So we saw with Miriam Abdallah Omar, it was retribution, but it was also protection. Black Diamond also asserted that part of the reason she joined Lurd was because if she didn't, she would be raped and killed. Others are forced to participate. And then other women find that participating in violence will allow them to advance their political goals and their political ideology. So there are a lot of reasons that people might participate in violence that is not about the violence itself, but is mainly because of some other things. And other scholars find that some of it is about material inducements as well. An example of this comes from Zora Drift's memoir. So she was a combatant in the FLN, and she engaged in acts of terror during the Algerian fight against the French. And she argued that for her, violence was purely instrumental because no woman is born a combatant, she became one. And she goes on to argue that she viewed violence, and as I'll show you in a second, as a way to provide justice, especially for civilians who had been harmed by the French government. And she argued that for over a century, Algeria had been raped and kidnapped, innocent people had been killed and subjected to oppression. And she made the choice to give up her life and her livelihood to fight in order to provide justice, right? And so she thought of her sacrifice in engaging in this type of violence as a way to pursue justice. And she specifically said that her participation was aimed at delivering justice, or she rationalized that her participation was aimed at delivering justice for the innocent civilian population, again, who had been raped and pillaged and taken advantage of for so long. So again, her activism or her activities as part of this rebellion were a way to minimize the effects of war on the civilian population. So we can argue that even women who might support violence or support violent actors may have some preference for a peaceful settlement relative to male combatants if, for example, they care about things like minimizing civilian casualties, right? And so it doesn't mean that they won't fight, but it could mean that if there are opportunities for settlement or for resolution that can minimize the cost for civilians, they might seize on these opportunities, right? And so they might, for example, if there's an opportunity that they perceive to negotiate to end a conflict, they might seize on that and may be more inclined to do so than male combatants. A second way that we can kind of think about women's this relationship between women and peace is that women's social power is such that they have to value things that are productive for peace or that facilitate peace, right? And so specifically, as I mentioned earlier, women rarely have access to the coercive tools that men have access to. So we're going to call this hard power. Women typically do not have hard power. And because of their social status in society, they have to rely on alternative ways of getting the things that they want or even communicating. And scholars have long argued that African women in particular have been wielding soft power in peace building in order to build up peace, to engage in peacemaking and to continue to build peace. And soft power here is just the ability to persuade with attraction rather than force or coercion, right? And so again, because they don't necessarily have access to coercive tools, they might use these other types of ways of compelling people to give them what they want or what they need. So there's a whole lot of interdisciplinary research that finds that relative to men, women tend to be a whole host of things that facilitate negotiations or facilitate compromise. So some scholars found that women are more collaborative. Others find that women tend to be less competitive than men, and specifically, they don't view negotiations or opportunities to negotiate as zero-sum games. They think of them as joint problems to be solved together. Other scholars have found that in experiments, women tend to be more cooperative or they're more willing to make compromises. Other scholars have argued that women tend to exhibit more empathy, and even they make more personal connections in negotiations, right? And these personal connections are a form of soft power. Instead of me forcing you to see my point, you want to see my point because now we feel like we're in this together. And other scholars have found that women tend to be less authoritarian and disagreeable. All of these things, especially the fact that women are allegedly more collaborative and more cooperative, we can imagine them having impacts on the willingness to offer conciliation or to pursue conciliation. And again, one question might be, so yes, we found this in experimental settings, in a lab or in a room where we put a bunch of people together, but do we also see this in these contexts of where these highly contentious contexts like wars, right? And again, there's quite a bit of evidence that women exhibit this behavior even in conflict zones. Right? So these examples abound, but I'll just give you a couple of them. Scholars have argued, like Bell, that women in Northern Ireland collaborated across factions with their perceived enemies to reframe issues just so that they could find a way to get to a settlement. There's been evidence that women in the Sudan People's Liberation Movement they continued to collaborate with each other even after there was a rift and the organization fractionalized. So when the organization broke apart, the women on either side of the split continued to collaborate with each other to solve key community issues, even when they were being punished by the men, even when they were being deterred by the men from communicating with each other. Women in the LJM, also in Sudan, worked with the government to create a united women's agenda around the Doha Agreement. And in Guatemala, the URNG collaborated with women in civil society to get their input on the peace process. So there's so many different instances where women negotiated or collaborated across the battlefield and collaborated with the people who are their perceived enemies in order to get to a settlement, because in some cases they viewed settlement as more important than the issues that divided them. And in a very, very contentious context, and I put this presentation together before the weeks of last week, so I just would like to be sensitive to the fact that this is a very highly contentious issue here. Research from Israel and Palestine suggested that there was even a gendered evaluation effect in Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, such that opponents were more receptive to deals when they viewed that they were negotiating with a female or feminine delegate. And so what does this mean? This meant that when a two-state solution was proposed, Mouse and David and Mouse found that Palestinian men, for example, were more inclined to accept that the two-state solution was fair when it was proposed by an Israeli woman as opposed to an Israeli man, and vice versa. An Israeli delegate was more likely to get a positive reception to the two-state solution when it was proposed by a Palestinian woman over a Palestinian man. And some studies might suggest or offer some explanations of why that is. And one of the explanations is that women tend to encourage what people view as ethical behavior. And so this is more about perceptions than maybe reality. But when you're negotiating with a woman, you have the perception that they're going to be more fair and that they're going to be more ethical, that women tend to be more trustworthy, they're less assertive, and they're warmer than men. And so this mechanism suggests that it's not just what that organization does and how they react, it's the perceptions of an opponent to that, to those proposals. And so this leads us to two main hypotheses. The first one is that gender diverse rebel groups are going to be more likely to negotiate with the state. And again, this can happen from a bunch of different perspectives. One of them is because we believe that organizations that have women in them are going to be more trustworthy, they're going to be more collaborative, they're going to help us solve some of the commitment problems we might have. But we can also see another mechanism that gender diverse rebel groups are going to sit in these negotiations with the state more frequently because of their own activism, right? Because those groups are going to be more likely to appeal for the opening of negotiations with the state. And so we test these two different hypotheses using some data on African conflicts and in contemporary civil conflicts. So from 1989 to 2014. And so with the data, how the data are structured is we have 126 rebel government dyads, or so pairings. And we construct a dyad year data set. And so we have two different outcome variables. The first one is just testing this general idea that they're going to sit in negotiations more frequently when women are among the combatants. And so this is a dichotomous variable. So it's coded either they had negotiations or they participated in negotiations in that given year or not. And so 61% of the dyads in our sample negotiate at some point, at some year. Over that time. And how we're defining this is both parties are present at a formal bargaining meeting in a given year. What we don't have is these back channel negotiations that no one can see. So there's probably way more instances of negotiation than we're able to catalog, but we're looking at these formal negotiations that are observable. And this aggregates data from a bunch of different sources where they collected data using the same measures and the same methods in Africa, and the results are robust to just including one of these measures as opposed to all of them together. And then to test that second hypothesis, that it's really about the group's own inclination toward compromise, we code rebel groups' appeals for negotiations. So specifically what we're looking at is when rebel groups either request, demand, or call for the government to open talks with that organization. And so again, this specifically tests their own initiative because these are statements that they make that say, we want you to open the negotiations this year. And so this is expanded data from Petchenkina and Thomas, 2020. So the explanatory variable in this study is just women's participation. And I'm happy to talk to you about the decision to think about women's participation writ large, as opposed to thinking about whether they participate as combatants or other ways that we can slice the data to think about their participation. But we look at participation in any role. And we attempt to construct a yearly data set. And so what this means is by a yearly data set is we try to find the first year that women have been integrated into these rebel organizations, and this is hard to do, which is one reason why we only focused in Africa. And so what we're coding here is the year that we know that women joined, or the year that multiple historical sources mentioned that women first appeared in these organizations. And we're using this yearly data set because we believe negotiations are dynamic, right? They change over time. And if we have this dynamic measure, we should also have a dynamic measure of women's participation here. And just so you can see, there is actually variation in how we coded it or women's participation. So in many of the rebel groups that we're looking at, women were participants from the very first year of the rebel organization's life, but we can see there are data going all the way out to the 10th year of of the organization being founded. Women just started participating then. So there is actually variation across these cases here. So we have a whole bunch of control variables, and I won't talk about each one of them, but we're trying to think about all the things that would explain when negotiation onset happens, or that would confound the relationship between women's participation and negotiation onset. And so we have variables that look at rebel and government violence, the level of democracy, attempts at mediation, how protracted the conflict is likely to be, and violence and support for rebel organizations, which if you're curious, we can talk about more of these things. But one of the things that's important is that we actually control for ideology here. And so I will not spend too much time focusing on these tables, but I just want you to see they exist, and that we find support for our analyses. For our hypotheses. And so this figure here, figure 1, shows the first difference. So it's the marginal effect of switching from a group that is all male to switching to a group that is heterogeneous or is gender diverse. And we can see that an increase or going from having an all-male organization to this gender diverse group increases the probability of a group participating in negotiations. And this changes the percentage. So the percentage change correlates to going from a 37% chance of being in negotiations when it's an all-male group to a 56% chance of being in negotiations when you're a gender diverse rebel organization. So this suggests some support for this first hypothesis. The second hypothesis, as I mentioned, doesn't just look at whether we're sitting at a table, it looks at the group's initiation of those talks. So when they make these appeals. And we can see that the effect is not quite as large on just the rebel group demands, but we do see a positive and statistically significant effect of women in these groups on groups' willingness to appeal for negotiations. And so when women are part of these organizations, we see that an increase of about 12 percentage point increase in the probability that these groups are going to make demands for negotiation. And so one question that we were plagued with while we were writing this paper is there some alternative story here, right? Is it that women are having a direct effect, or is it that women are changing some other attribute of the rebel organization that then gets them to the table, right? And so specifically what we're thinking is it's possible that it's no direct effect, right? There's not an actual direct effect of putting a female combatant or a set of female combatants in a rebel organization on negotiations. What it is that women change something like the strength of the rebel organization or their bargaining leverage, which then has this trickle-down effect on these outcomes that we're interested in. So we want to test this. And we have two different types of ways of thinking about this, two different mechanisms. The first one is that we argue that it's possible that women are just changing a rebel group's power to hurt the state. And that power to hurt is what's actually changing their incidence of sitting in negotiations or their willingness to push the government to negotiate. And so there are two kind of ways that we conceptualize this and that we measure this. The first one is through rebel strength. So this makes sense, right? We add more female combatants, the group becomes larger, and because it's a larger group, they have the ability to contest on the battlefield, or a greater ability to contest on the battlefield, which then increases the chance that the government will view a rebel organization as a viable bargaining partner. Other studies, including some of my own research, shows that terrorism can also boost the power to hurt. And we also know that groups that use women for terrorism are able to exact more lethal terror attacks, right? And so we're able to kill more people, hurt more people, which hurts the state, which might compel them to negotiate. And so there are two ways that we can kind of think about how women might boost the power to hurt these groups, which might have this indirect effect on negotiations. Another pathway that could also exist is that women might boost the legitimacy of these rebel organizations. And so there's been quite a bit of work showing that when women are present in rebel organizations, the perception of those groups is that they're more legitimate. And part of this is that women, because we believe that they have an aversion to violence, when they are present in a rebel organization, we think that the group's goals are more legitimate, or the group's goals are more broad-based and they're less narrow. And indeed, studies have tried to test this and have found that when women are in these organizations, or when people perceive that women are in rebel organizations, they are perceived as more legitimate and they're more likely to attract things like external support. And so we test this in 3 different ways as well, by thinking about this pathway from women's participation in these groups to boosting legitimacy, which then should have an impact on negotiations. Again, more legitimate rebel groups might be more acceptable bargaining partners. And so we look at how women might boost rebel groups' governance efforts. And we know that often rebel organizations will send women out on the ground to interface with the civilian population. And so they allow them to engage in better rebel governance, which this might have an impact on negotiations. We looked at civilian support, and we also look at external state support here to, again, see this indirect pathway that maybe it's not that women are directly affecting negotiations, is that they're boosting the group's legitimacy, which has this impact on negotiations. And so I'll show you the results in a second, but when we do this, we find that there really is not any strong empirical support for this indirect mechanism or any of these indirect mechanisms. We don't typically see that women boost the rebel group's power to hurt, which then affects negotiations. And we don't typically see that women boost the group's legitimacy that then has this effect on boosting their appeal as a negotiating partner. The only exception is with rebel strength, but as I'll show you in a minute, this is a very small effect. It doesn't really take away from the broader direct effect here. And so we use causal mediation analysis to assess this indirect pathway that we talk about. And causal mediation analysis is useful because it allows you to simultaneously assess both direct and indirect effects. And basically what it allows us to do is assess whether this relationship between the treatment, and so here the treatment is just women's participation in these groups, is working mainly through some mediator variable. So those are all the things that we just talked about, the ways to measure power to hurt, or the ways to measure legitimacy. And so at a risk of boring you guys to tears, there are 3 main quantities of interest here. One is the average direct effect here. And so basically that's just the effect of women on negotiations that does not act through any of those causal pathways that I just mentioned. And then there's the average causal mediated effect. And so this is the effect of this conflict behavior, so terrorism or civilian victimization or rebel strength or these other ways to measure legitimacy, holding women constant. And then the total effect is when we add the average direct effect and the ACME together. And so that is looking at the average causal mediated effect, so that indirect effect, and the average direct effect would be the total effect. And so just conceptually, what it would mean is that if we're looking at the ACME, this is the effect on negotiations that is not attributable to this direct effect and vice versa. Okay, so I'll start with the ones that are not significant, and then I'll come back to the one that is. And so basically, I just talked to you about these these different quantities of interest. The ACME here these are coefficients, is the causal mediated effect. And so that's the part of the effect on negotiations that acts through the behavior, the rebel group behavior. The average direct effect is just women on negotiations, and then the total is this last one. And so if the causal mediated effect was mainly driving this relationship, we would not only see it significant, but we would see that it would have an impact on the total effect. But as we can see, because the AD and the total effect are largely similar, we can see that most of the effect in these models is coming from the direct effect of women on negotiations, not through some other causal chain. So when we look at external support, when we looked at the group's use of terrorism, when we look at the group's ability to get ethnic support among the civilian population, and then when we look at their governance efforts, we don't see any causal mediation here. So it's not that women are boosting legitimacy or women are boosting the power to hurt, and then that's having an impact on negotiations. We're just seeing, again, this direct effect. The only causal mediated effect here is actually through rebel strength, which makes sense, right? We add more women in the group gets larger, and therefore we have the ability to contest the state on the battlefield. But again, this is a very small effect. Even though this is significant, most of the effect in these models is coming from a direct effect of women on negotiations. And so what does this tell us? This tells us that rebel women are able to influence groups' willingness and ability to engage in formal bargaining, but this is not happening primarily through women's effect on boosting rebels' power or legitimacy. It's happening because we added women to these groups, right? It's something specific about the women that is really what's driving this relationship. And what we argue is that this does not explain everything, but it explains a good part of it. Some of it is just changing these groups' willingness to engage in conciliation and willingness to engage in talks. And so the implications of this is that we should think about shifting the emphasis in women, peace, and security, right? Away from just thinking that the only women that can have an impact on peace are civilian women, or the only women that can have an impact on peace are the ones that work through peace movements, or the only women that might have an impact on peace are the women in the government. There might be a role here, or I'm showing evidence that there is a role of thinking about how we might better incorporate militant women because they can affect the organizations that they participate in. Some of the things that we don't really know right now, and we certainly don't know from my study, is that women, I'm sorry, before I go to that, women within rebel groups might have more leverage over those groups than women on the outside, right? So if we're thinking about how women might have an impact on the peace process, specifically in getting belligerents to the table, it's possible that if we're thinking about a compellant effect, it would make more sense to go to the women that have some legitimacy with that rebel group, as opposed to relying on women that don't have much of a relationship with this group to make them stop fighting or make them sit down at the bargaining table. However, what we cannot assess from this study, and as far as I know, no one is assessed, is how women's influence within that rebel group might influence their ability to actually compel these groups, right? So here we're just treating all women's participation as equal. We have this dichotomous variable, just we look at whether they're women or not. We don't even look at the number of women there are. We do have a bunch of robustness checks, so I can talk about those. But for the most part, we're not really thinking about any variation in women, which is pretty much the problem with the women, peace, and security agenda. And so subsequent research might think about even variation within these groups, how certain types of women within these groups might have a greater compelling effect. Or conversely, there's been quite a bit of literature that says that even when we can look at the average effect of women on institutions or even rebellion, women in leadership roles might act very differently than just the average rank and file woman. And so it might make sense to think about the effect of women in leadership roles on these rebel groups. And just without showing you any more regressions, we do look at this and we find actually most of the effect is driven by rank and file women, and very little effect is being driven by women in leadership. And that kind of makes sense, right? When we think about the women who rise up in power within these rebel organizations, they're not necessarily the same as the regular rank and file women, and they're not that different necessarily than rebel men leaders, right? Even though I showed you that there is some evidence that there is. And so this kind of points to us really thinking seriously about heterogeneity in women, and not just whether women are combatants or not, but even thinking about things like interests of female combatants or female rebels, right? And this is something that I think is where the literature and where even practice should be headed. How am I doing on time? How much more time do I have? A couple. Oh man. Okay. So I will just tell you the other part of this study this talk that I intended to focus on before I talk too long, is I have this other paper that just came out in APSR that thinks about the actual impact of female combatants on the shape of peace in a different way. Not just whether they get to the table, but how they might change the outcome, right? How they might change what peace agreements and what settlements look like. And what I show in this paper is that female rebels are shaping the path of shaping this peace process in really important ways because they're encouraging terms that benefit women. And so the question that is open from the last study is, okay, so we sit down in negotiations and women force these groups to do that, but does that change the terms of these negotiations? Does it change what they're looking for? In this paper, I show that they do. So I'll just really quickly jump through just the basic argument here. I argue that women's participation in rebellion is important because it presents a window of opportunity for these women to influence post-conflict politics. And so not only does it change their willingness to do so, it also changed their opportunity to do so, right? And so in my very limited amount of time, there's been quite a bit of studies that have shown that women in rebellion kind of sometimes circumvent gender norms. They're able to take on these roles and responsibilities that are very different than the things that they did before conflict. And many of them want to avoid regressions back to the status quo, right? I became a combatant, I was able to read, I took on a job, and I don't want to just go back to being a woman who stays at home, right? And so the peace process actually provides this opportunity to cement some of these changes in this legally binding document, right? Because what we know is these peace agreements are legally binding documents. They're not just scraps of paper. And because this is an opportunity for us to compromise, women find this is a key opportunity for them to try to push some changes through that are going to benefit them before that window of opportunity closes. So once settlements are done, many of them get demobilized, go back home, and they don't really have a lot of opportunities to impact post-conflict peace. And when we think about an opportunity, these female rebels, as I mentioned before, already have access to the militant groups by being within them, right? By having some leverage over the leadership, especially when they participate in the political and military leadership here. And in other cases, even when they're not just pushing the rebels to adopt these terms and represent their interests, there's evidence that just seeing so many women participate in violence and in a rebellion can cause people from the outside to say, look, we can't just ignore women anymore. And so in the Communist Party in Nepal, the Maoists found the women's participation in the CPNM showed people that it wasn't really possible anymore to just ignore women the way that they used to because of the sheer force and visibility of women. And so even when women aren't directly pressuring these organizations, it could be that they're receiving pressure from the outside to represent women's interests. And so in this paper, I kind of look at the different types of interests that rebel women have that might be represented in peace agreements. I make the case that, again, they're not heterogeneous. They're not going to just want the same things that any woman in society might want. They're going to want some things that are informed by their backgrounds. Here, I argue that some of the key things that we can observe is that women are recruited from among excluded and marginalized groups of society. We know that that's how, so looking at things like Sederman et al., they show that the groups who typically rebel are those who are economically and politically disadvantaged. And so we can imagine that rebel women are among these groups. And they also have these militant identities, which are going to inform the types of things that they ask for. And so just to jump ahead, all these slides, these results generally show that female combatants do influence the shape of the peace process by advocating for provisions that demand equality for women, but specific groups of marginalized and excluded women in society. And they also tend to prioritize provisions that represent militant women's interests. And so those are things like DDR benefits and rehabilitation benefits. These things are important, though, because 1325 identifies that it's important to get women at the table. In the document and some of the subsequent resolutions, although they acknowledge that female combatants exist, they largely identify a role for civilian women in peacekeeping, and they also want things like women in DDR. This paper shows that it's not going to be easy to get to some of those things without also thinking about the women who are going to demand those things. Right. And so in this paper, I showed that other groups of women don't necessarily advocate for women in DDR. Right. So when we have women in civil society represented, they don't necessarily push for demobilization, reintegration, and disarmament for rebel women because this is not in their interest. And so just thinking about the long term, it suggests that female combatants have these important impacts on the shape of peace, but they're typically overlooked as important conflict actors. We never forget about the male rebels. They're always at the peace table, yet somehow we can forget about including these women who sometimes make up a sizable part of these organizations. And just think about what would be the cost of ignoring 40% of the men in a rebel organization? We can't fathom that, but this is often what happens to these women in these organizations. And when we start to think about them as conflict actors that have their own interests and incentives, we see that maybe they do have some impact. And the two studies that I showed you together show you different ways that they might have an impact. One of them is on the opening of negotiations. And this one that I didn't focus on quite as much is on what they're actually negotiating for. And all of these things have downstream consequences for women in society and even civilian women. So I'll stop here so that we can get some questions. Thank you so much for listening. I look forward to your questions.